I've always loved the idea of RPGs, fighting monsters, upgrading your gear, and slowly becoming strong enough to take down the final boss. So I thought, why not try making my own? I'd never really done anything like it before, so I knew this would be a challenge. And originally I thought it'd take about maybe a month, but spoiler alert, it took way longer than that. But before I could open up Unity and start building, I needed a solid idea. I decided to go with a 2D pixel art style like most of my other games, and a classic fantasy theme. The story, simple but epic. The world was once peaceful, no monsters, no magic, no chaos, but everything changed when a dark sorcerer named Velmor discovered an ancient orb of chaos. He used its power to unleash dark magic across the realm, creating twisted creatures and terrifying monsters. Kingdoms fell, the sky grew dark, and Velmor crowned himself as the ruler of the broken world. Only one kingdom still stands, Ilaria, weakened, crumbling, but still alive. And that's where our hero comes in. Once a humble peasant, now a sword-bearing warrior chosen by fate. His goal? Defeat Velmor and bring peace back to the world. So with the story in place, I finally opened up Unity and created the project. So once the project was created, I jumped right into making a sprite for the player. I did a bit of experimenting, some versions looked too goofy, others way too serious, but eventually I landed on this one. It wasn't perfect, but it looked decent enough to get things moving. With the sprite ready, I moved on to animating. I made simple idle and running animations which added more life to the character, and then I added it into Unity and started working on player movement and control. After hours of tweaking and coding, I had smooth player movement and a simple walking animation up and running. Pause. Now, it's pretty crucial to note that this took me a few hours to complete. I had to brainstorm the sprite of the character, then animate it, which took me a while to figure out. I had to look at a lot of inspiration, and then I had to not just create the game object and code the basic movement, but also configure the animation so they play correctly when the player moves and stops moving. Now, this is just to show you that just a simple thing like this already took me hours to set up, so you can imagine the more complicated stuff that came after this. Now, next up was the tile map, and if you don't know what a tile map is, it's basically a grid of tiny little blocks that make up the game's world. Things like grass, walls, buildings, and more. Now, since my game isn't purely top-down or fully 2D, it's got some depth. So I needed to create both a ground layer and a set of interactable objects that the player could walk around and collide with. Now that part would be pretty tricky later on, but for now I made the first tile set, which consisted mostly of bright green grass, some bushes, flowers, and some dirt, and then I opened Unity's sprite editor, sliced everything into 16 by 16 tiles, and laid out the map, and here's how it turned out. Now I think it's time to explain how I wanted the progression to work in this game. Since I didn't want to go completely overboard, I planned out 3 main worlds plus a final boss world where the player would face off against the final boss, Velmor. Each world would have its own unique environment and enemies to keep things fresh. The game would begin in the kingdom of Ilaria, located in a bright, peaceful plains biome. This intro area wouldn't have any enemies, it would purely set up the story, so I decided it wouldn't count as one of the main worlds. Here, the player would talk to NPCs, learn about the world, pick up their first sword and armor, and officially begin their journey to defeat Velmor. After that, they travel through a dangerous forest, a haunted graveyard, a magical cave filled with arcane energy, and finally, Velmor's twisted castle. Now of course this meant I had a lot to code, a full NPC dialogue system, tons of unique enemies, an actual combat system, a fun sense of progression, and much more. So to avoid overwhelming myself, I decided to start simple by building the kingdom of Ilaria first, and once that was done, I'd move on to designing the other worlds where the real battles would begin. Now to start building out the world, I began by creating some simple stone walls that would serve as the borders of the kingdom. This helped me get used to making obstacles that felt natural in the environment. And though it wasn't perfect, it worked well enough for now. Next, I wanted to lay the foundation for my combat system. I didn't want anything too complex, just basic sword swinging with the idea that the player could eventually upgrade their sword to deal more damage. Here's what the sword swing animation ended up looking like, and honestly, I think it turned out pretty clean. Now, perfecting this sword swing attack took me hours to get right. I had multiple bugs where the animation wouldn't fully play or was just bugging out, but eventually I got it working and I could move on. Now, the way the sword swing animation would work is basically there's an invisible hitbox on the player's sword that checks for a game object with the enemy tag, and if it's colliding with an enemy and the player clicked, it will play the animation and do damage to the enemy. At this point, I turned my current scene into a kind of test zone. somewhere where I could experiment with mechanics before building the actual kingdom scene. And of course, I needed something to fight. I decided to start out with a classic, a slime. It would be the most basic enemy in the entire game, and I planned for it to appear in the forest world later on. I created a simple slime sprite and set it up so that when the player attacked, the slime would take damage and disappear when defeated. It was a small step, but super satisfying. Now up until this point, all the combat systems I'd made in previous games were projectile based, so melee combat was a new territory for me. Getting it to feel smooth and responsive would definitely be a challenge. To move things forward, I added a health bar for the player and made the slime follow and damage the player on contact. Then I created a basic attacking animation for the slime that plays when it hits the player, and honestly, seeing everything in action was starting to look pretty cool. I also made a simple game over screen that shows up when the player runs out of health, and after that I decided the environment needed a bit more life, so I made a tree sprite, placed a few around the scene, and suddenly the world started to feel less empty. With all that set up, I felt ready to start actually building the Kingdom of Aria, the place where the game officially begins. So I grabbed everything from the test scene, the walls, the trees, the tile map, and began putting together the starting area of the game. Now, for this opening area, our main character, who I've now decided to name Rowan, needed a new version of his sprite where he wasn't wearing armor or holding a sword. So I created a new sprite of him in his peasant clothes and added idle and running animations. I dropped him into the game using the same player movement script as before, and it worked great. Next, I needed to give the kingdom some life, so I found a free top-down pixel house sprite on itch.io, added it to the scene, and set up the proper collision so the player couldn't walk through the walls. Then I wanted to make a new enemy that would also appear in the forest world, a goblin. I designed the sprite along with idle, running, and attack animations. By the way guys, I'm thinking about releasing merch, so if you have any favorite characters or any cool design ideas, leave a comment. I'll put a pinned comment on this video with the store link once it's out, so stay tuned. The goblin would be faster than the slime, and it would stab the player with a knife and attack more quickly too. Once everything was set up, the goblin was fully implemented and ready to fight. With that done, I refocused on the Kingdom of Aria. It was time to start adding the NPCs and little details to make the area feel more alive. I made a few NPC sprites, and since I had no clue how to make a dialogue system from scratch, I followed some tutorials from this YouTube channel called Game Code Library. Huge shout out to them. And after a few hours of work, the dialogue system worked flawlessly. I created this wizard NPC to be the first character the player meets, gave him some dialogue, and then started adding polish to the town. I placed lanterns around houses, implemented lighting, and added different colored tents, not just for decoration but also to show that the civilians are sleeping in tents since there aren't enough homes left after everything that's happened. The whole area started to feel much more alive. NPCs would now even turn to face the player as they walked by. I even added a few knights around the kingdom, including some guarding a gate at the edge of the town. If you talk to the gate knights, they tell you that you need armor before you can leave. That's when I added a sword and a armor pile that the player can interact with. Once you pick them up, you're allowed to begin your journey. I also made a small indicator that shows which NPCs can be interacted with, and with all that done, Aria was complete, and it meant it was finally time to begin work on the Forest of Whispers. The first thing I did to start was copy the existing Kingdom of Aria scene I had and delete the old tile map. Since this new area was going to be a forest, I needed a tile map that actually fit that. So I basically just recolored the existing one into a darker green, and after that I recolored the tree and made a fallen log that would be placed at the entrance of the forest. Once I added the trees and set up the log's collision, I threw in a few slimes and tested out the scene. I decided to make them made out of bushes so they didn't feel too out of place, and after spending some time configuring their collision, I added a lantern near the entrance log and made a heart item that the player could find to heal. After that, I laid out the shape of the forest, which for now is just a simple path to the end, though I'll definitely change that later in development. Then came the final enemy of the forest, the treeling. I wanted this one to be much beefier than the slime or the goblin, and so I got to work on the sprite, and after way too long of adjusting the proportions, I ended up with this. I made idle and running animations, and for the attack, I gave it a green fire spit that deals tons of damage. Then I also made a texture for a gold bar and made every enemy drop them as a currency I would implement later on. Once that was done, I made a placeholder main menu for the game with a cool background, and to make the cool background, I finally had to design the main villain, Velmor. He's a dark, evil mage with glowing purple eyes and a staff holding the orb of chaos. This is how it all came together. Now, you might be surprised to hear that, unlike my usual videos, the game isn't fully done yet. Yup, apparently you can't make a full RPG in 1 month and also have a life. So yeah, I'm still working on the game. There's a lot more to build, more worlds, more enemies, more mechanics, and that's where you come in. Drop a comment with something you'd love to see in the game, an enemy, a mechanic, a weapon, maybe even just a fun idea. I'll be reading through all of them. Also, if you enjoyed this video, liking and subscribing helps a ton, and if you want to follow the game more closely or share your ideas with others, you can join my game studio's official Discord, link in the description. I'll be back with part 2 once I finish the game. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.